Welcome to the PUTTcast podcast by Pharmacists United for Truth and Transparency. Pharmacists United for Truth and Transparency is the only registered 501c3 nonprofit wholly dedicated to exposing the hard truths about pharmacy benefit managers and how their greed-centered, profit-at-any-cost business practices are driving up drug prices and healthcare premiums while reducing consumer choice and endangering patient access. To learn more, visit our website at truthrx.org.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the next episode of the PUTTcast, brought to you by Pharmacists United for Truth and Transparency. I'm Lauren Young. I'm the Vice President of the PUTT Board and the host of the PUTTcast. I have one of our fabulous board members with me, Chris Hobart from the great state of Texas, as my co-host today. So welcome, Chris.
Hey, thanks, Lauren. My name is Chris Hobart. I'm an independent pharmacist and pharmacy owner in Lubbock, Texas. Also a proud PUTT board member, the Texas Legislative Vice Chair, and I'm trying to do a lot legislatively here in Texas. And I'm going to introduce our guest today. Everyone, please say hello to Chris Deacon. Chris is an attorney. She's the founder of Versan Consulting. She's the former Deputy Attorney General of New Jersey and Director of the New Jersey State Health Plan. So welcome, Chris.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, Chris, why don't you give our listeners a little bit of information as to, if they've seen you on LinkedIn, if they've maybe been following what you've been doing. I know that we have some pharmacy owner friends in New Jersey. I know that, the eastern side of the United States is not taking PBM reform lightly.
Sure. Before I do that, though, if you do have New Jersey pharmacists listening, shout out to Joe from Delran Pharmacy. Saved me a ton of times. So I'm really passionate about saving independent pharmacies in the U.S.
Shout out to Joe.
So I'm Chris Deacon, as you said, sort of a recovering attorney. I have served in the public sector side and private sector side over the years, but I really got my feet wet in healthcare by running the state health benefits plan for New Jersey's public sector employees. We covered about 820,000 lives during the time I was there. So all state employees, local employees, school teachers, first responders, universities, you name it. During that time, obviously worked with some of the big PBMs and also heard from our independent pharmacists across the state a lot. After I left the state, I formed Versan Consulting, where I continue to work with large employers and employer coalitions, advocating for smarter purchasing decisions to be made on the purchaser side, and really sort of just hammering home how important it is to be a fiduciary to your health plan. When I started with the state plan, I very quickly realized that I couldn't know everything. This is such a complex space. Mm-hmm. But what I could do is formulate a framework for making smart decisions. And, that framework really is what it means to be a fiduciary. And if you keep those principles in mind in making decisions for your plan, you will ultimately reach the right decision.
Absolutely. The best part of being an independent pharmacy owner is getting to educate our patients, getting to educate employers about that. And so if you come at it from that, making sure you are educating them for the right reasons, that's exactly what our goal is. We're trying to get the right patient, the right medication at the right time. So it's kind of in line with what you're discussing. Well, in your, recovering attorney days, I know that a lot of our listeners were glued to the computer screens during the Rutledge versus PCMA decision in the Supreme Court just a few years ago, back in 2020. And that was really when pharmacy owners got a chance outside the state of Arkansas to see what really could happen on a federal agency level with that support. And I know there's people who did not even know ERISA was an acronym at that point. They didn't know, anything about that. And so that, that was kind of a lot of pharmacy owners first, putting their toe into the pond of what exactly all of these crazy other acronyms outside of what we live in the pharmacy world entail. Right. And so that, whenever that decision came down, the unanimous 8-0 decision, I think a lot of owners were like, awesome. So the next day, that's when other states will do what Arkansas did, right? There'll be an Act 900, across all 49 states. PBMs will have to be on lockdown. Like, this is great. And maybe you can speak to this a little bit now. Have you seen any implications or changes in regards to that? I know that it's shaped a lot of the policies that we're seeing in other states, but I know that legislators are still nervous to have a similar law because PCMA or other PBM opposition groups do say, whoa, this, circumvents ERISA, preempts ERISA. What this is really going to make our employers mad, our unions mad, fill in the blank mad. And right. So legislators obviously don't want to do that. So is there anything that you can kind of give us hope, maybe owners about that decision?
I think the Rutledge decision empowered state governments and policymakers at the state level to push further into this area, right? The relating to an ERISA covered plan, like that language, it used to be that preemption was more or less a sword, right? That would be waived by the industry and some of the industry trade groups and some of the large employer trade groups, quite frankly, that, preemption, can't do this, preemption. If it in any way touches our plan, preemption. And it really did scare folks. That being said, somebody was willing to challenge that notion, thank goodness, and stuck with it. And then we got the Rutledge decision. And so, states are being much more aggressive in pushing in, maybe not as quickly and as we might hope, but, I see state legislation being, introduced, passed. I know Florida's passed legislation where I don't think they would have before. I think you're getting a lot of fast followers. That being said, I do think that they will continue to get challenged because not every piece of legislation is the same in each state. So there are going to be different aspects that are challenged. But I think it's positive. I think there will be change at the federal level, probably in the next couple of years. There's just so much out there about, the PBMs. And quite frankly, if a state legislator says, no, we can't do this because of preemption, I think that's just sort of, for lack of a better word, it's disingenuous. I think they don't want to tick off big, important people that give a lot of money to campaigns and saying, oh, preemption is just it's a really easy way out.
Mm-hmm. I've found that it's really hard to get anyone to enforce anything as well. That's been my biggest hurdle, is finding anyone to enforce. Our attorney general in Texas had stated that, they can't hide behind ERISA. Our House bills that we have are not preempted. And still the Texas Department of Insurance won't bring any cases forward. Anytime I've tried to call, we get, I can tell you've probably dealt with the Department of Insurance as well, but more than once. But that's what I've seen. I've just seen, not only do they not want to upset people, but they also don't want to, no one wants to enforce these laws. No one wants to be the one that's going to do it and, have to fight these conglomerates. Is that what you've seen as well?
Yeah. And I think enforcement, it's been an issue with, price transparency laws and requirements. It's definitely a problem with, these types of laws. And call me cynical, but I think it's because of, sort of the regulatory capture, which is basically, the people running the, insurance commissioner's office or the people running the Department of Health who are responsible for sanctioning or enforcing these laws are either from that industry or they have a desire to go to that industry after their time at the commission or after their time at the Department of Health. And you don't have to take my word for it. I guarantee you, if you, look at some high-level staff in your own commissioner's department, you would see that they are probably have come from or are going to historically industry. So it is very difficult for them to play that enforcement role. So when I sort of advise on legislation, I often recommend that this enforcement goes to like an AG or goes to a comptroller's office, because, industry regulating itself, it doesn't work.
Absolutely. And there's so many loopholes that PBMs have been able to find that you need multiple prongs to the enforcement mechanism and also legislation. And also you need everyone to make sure they're rowing the same direction. And so, with all the effort that goes into getting those laws passed and across the finish line, you want to make sure that the second part of that, the enforcement part, is as ironclad as possible.
Right. Absolutely. And I think there is a role for constituents to play here too. There's nothing more important to a politician than a vote, right? And I do think when constituents pick up the phone and call their representative or email with an actual story of what's happening to them, it matters, and they will return that call or listen to that constituent. So I would say too, there's definitely a role for, folks like you in industry to step up and try and play a policy role, but constituents can be super powerful here.
And it's interesting because legislators do tend to have their bios on their website, and it does show, whether they have an interest in education or healthcare or something like that. So as pharmacy owners, you typically have a patient that has a story that a legislator will connect with.
Right. Absolutely. And like my pharmacist, Joe, he didn't know who I was at the time when sort of I called on him as a member of the community. But lo and behold, I was running the state's health plan and was able to, try and give him a voice as an independent pharmacist. And certainly I learned from him and took that voice with me to work.
Mm-hmm. That's incredible. Again, great job, Joe.
Yeah.
Great job.
Another shout out for Joe.
We love to hear that. Well, I know that you kind of touched on this a little bit. We do hear fiduciary a lot come up. That's not the most popular F word that comes up around PBMs, but it's definitely one that we are becoming very well acquainted with. But that is not a PBM friendly word. Typically, whenever you hear fiduciary, it is in response to them saying, whoa, that's not our role. That's not what we do. Could you touch a little bit on why the fiduciary concept is, so foreign to PBMs or not as easily enforced?
Sure. So I think to sort of back up, the fundamental principle as to what it means to be a fiduciary is pretty simple. When I am exercising control or discretion over somebody else's money, I owe that person a special duty of care. I owe them there's a special trust relationship now established because I'm holding your funds and I have discretion over what to do with them. And so that's when your fiduciary duty is triggered, so to speak. And that is your duty of loyalty, solely in the interest of your plan and plan participants, duty of prudence. So I have to act with the care, skill, and diligence of a prudent expert, follow plan documents, and sort of a duty to monitor and pay only reasonable expenses. And that duty is absolutely on the employer or the group health plan sponsor. But if you think about it, right, most employers today sign a contract with a PBM and essentially say, tell me what I owe for claims, and they pay it. They're not necessarily given the tools to monitor. They're not provided with the data to make sure they're paying reasonable plan expenses. So because of that, who fills that gap? That's where the PBM is operating in sort of this discretionary area. They're handling vast sums of money from these employers and their members, deciding who gets more money for that prescription and who gets fees for this and what specialty pharmacy, regardless of the impact on the employer and the member, right? Often steering to their own pharmacies or requiring you to do mail when that absolutely might not be in your plan and plan participants' best interests. So I think right now, the uncomfortable middle is, well, if the group health plan doesn't have the information or access to data in order to make those decisions, and the PBM is saying, we don't have to disclose it and we're not a fiduciary, that's where we are right now. We're stuck in the middle where nobody's doing this. And that's why we find ourselves in this situation. That's why we find ourselves, with cases like there's a case, Johnson & Johnson, a whistleblower brought a class action against Johnson & Johnson as the employer for breaching their fiduciary duty, failing to monitor. And one of the egregious examples that they bring up in the case is a $10,000 drug. Well, they purchased it from ESI for $10,000, but it's something they could have gotten from, the pharmacy paying cash for $50, right? Like a 1,000% markup.
Wow.
How can that be prudent, right? Exactly. So in that instance, the employees are suing the employer to say, you didn't do your job. Now, these cases are still working their way through the courts, but it's that tension between who's holding that ball, that fiduciary ball, that I think is what's allowing it to sort of drop through the cracks, and nobody's monitoring. Nobody's looking at reasonable plan expenses. Nobody's making sure that we're looking out for the plan and plan participants alone. And not necessarily because there's a lack of will on the employer's part, but there's a lack of ability due to, this opaque, non-transparent system that we've built.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I know that employers are trying to get back a return on investment on the millions of dollars they're spending for healthcare costs, but that's not what they're finding in the more transparency that keeps coming out.
Right.
And without every single payment of the PBM, like whatever they took back through an audit, whatever they took back from a rebate aggregator or something like that, without those transactions being monitored by the plan fiduciary, to me, I just don't see how that doesn't qualify them as a fiduciary if they're able to contract that money into these third-party contracts, right?
It's a fair question. And on the TPA side, at least, there has been more case law developed as to whether a third-party administrator or, a vendor exercising discretion over, how much a provider gets paid or what amount of fees get paid, being able to manipulate a billed and allowed charge, in order to enhance your recoveries. Like, there have been cases, and there's a recent circuit case actually that said that was enough to make the TPA a fiduciary, even though the contract said they weren't. So the court is basically saying, you might say you're not, but in fact, you are a functional fiduciary because you're acting like one, because you're exercising control over somebody else's money. Therefore, you owe a special duty of care. But in the PBM space, it is, again, going back to how would an employer even begin to do that without the information that they should be entitled to? And I think that we're working at the state and federal level to codify, not only the frequency of the data being exchanged for the employer, but the format so that they can do that. Because you're right. I mean, having sat in a purchaser seat, I know that Optum, CVS, ESI, they can present numbers that make it look like they're saving you a boatload of money, when in reality, maybe that rebate wouldn't be as big if I wasn't being steered to that big name brand in the first place, right? But I wouldn't know that. So yeah, I mean, we know there's all kinds of games, and again, without that transparency, I don't think we're going to get there.
Right.
I think, we have the T word and the F word, and they become marketing schemes for a lot of businesses. The T word being sort of the transparency, transparent PBM, we're a transparent TPA, we're a transparent insert name here. And that's great. You can, if you want to call yourself and put yourself in that bucket, but any purchaser out there needs to verify what does that mean? Right?
Right.
Am I also getting under the hood to see the direct and indirect revenue streams on the back end? And then the other is fiduciary. Like you'll probably see, I hear all the time, oh, we're a fiduciary enabled X, or we're a fiduciary validated Y. Like that's not how fiduciary duty works. Like it's just not. But they have become very nice buzzwords and marketing words that, should give you pause, quite frankly, especially with the fiduciary. I mean, the transparent, that is sort of a category now. But to your point, you always have to look under the hood on revenue streams.
One thing I've thought of is, I get audited by these companies that are acting on behalf of fiduciaries. I don't even think I'm legally allowed to share the findings of those audits with the fiduciary. Like I'm barred from doing that. So even if I wanted to, I would not legally be allowed to do that. And, if you're trusting, I guess, the PBM to do that, I don't see how it's in their best interest to disclose that with you either. So a lot of those contracts they come in, there's non-disclosures like we were talking about, things that block access to that. Chris, were you mentioning the Tierra Yachts case?
Yes.
I read through that. I thought it was a masterclass. Y'all's Verson group there used the same cases that the PBM lawyers had used and used that same information to prove fiduciary that they were trying to use to not prove fiduciary. Fantastic job you guys did. So.
That wasn't my case, but I did write about it.
Oh, I thought it was okay.
No, that's I believe the Vernon law firm. They did the Hylex case too, which was probably the first case to really explore this topic several years ago on fiduciary duty. So they're doing some great work, and hopefully, if that gets appealed, they take it all the way.
Yes, so can you talk about the yachts case a little bit for our listeners that?
Sure. Yeah. So the facts of the case, we have a self-funded employer who hired Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan to be their TPA. Fast forward a couple years into the contract, and a whistleblower at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan notices that all of their out-of-network claims that are being processed outside of the state of Michigan are paid at billed, meaning if a dermatologist out-of-network dermatologist sent in a $10,000 bill for a mole removal, they would get $10,000. Or if they sent a $100,000 bill, they would get $100,000. And he recognized this was a problem, raised it internally. And Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan, their internal emails show that number one, they said, we have a fiduciary duty to our self-funded clients to enforce their plans, and we're not doing that. And number two, this is costing our self-funded employers tens of millions of dollars. Because what they were doing, and I should have backed up and said this, it was a programmed flip. So there was something in their internal claim system that actually triggered full payment at billed charges and not payment in accordance with the plan terms that they had. So this was an intentional programmed thing that was happening. They became aware of it, and rather than fix it or informed their self-funded employers, they decided to roll out a rather robust recovery services program, which then would say, well, we're going to take that $10,000 and we're going to negotiate that down to 2, and we're going to take 30% of the difference, right? So they would engage in retrospective reviews, and that was quite profitable for them.
Oh, yeah.
Tierra Yachts learned about it through this whistleblower, and they brought a case, and the district court dismissed it on standing grounds. They basically said, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan's not a fiduciary. They don't owe you any special, anything other than what their contractual rights are. If anything, this is a breach of contract. Go take it to state court. They appealed that, and the Sixth Circuit recognized that Blue Cross Blue Shield here had an immense amount of discretion. They got to decide what providers were paid in the first instance. They got to decide whether or not they would engage in the recovery, and they got to decide, what that threshold would be. And they were knowledgeable of the programming and did nothing to fix it. So they reversed and said, absolutely, this is a breach of fiduciary duty. It was a really strong opinion. And so it's now going to be kicked back down to the district court to be litigated. And I just got to say, those emails, that's before discovery. That's before we actually get to uncovering of what occurred and transpired internally in these discussions. So I either think it's going to settle for a lot, or maybe they fight it out.
Nice.
Wow. Again, it was just incredible to see. Again, I saw your LinkedIn post that kind of broke down that appeal, the reversal. Mm-hmm. And that was so interesting because I know that there are other employers. You kind of talked about Johnson & Johnson's case. I know that Wells Fargo has a case that their employees have also put up about fiduciary responsibility. And so this is coming forward a lot more now. I think employers are getting a lot smarter about what's happening because they're seeing their costs just continue to go up, and they know that they can't afford to hire a TPA for a TPA that they already have. So they really need to figure out how to fix what's broken. It's
an important case standing for the principle that, again, going back to that exercising discretion over other people's money. And that's what PBMs, that's their jam, right? Mm-hmm. That's what they do. And Department of Labor actually weighed in on that appeal. Oh, so we got an insight into what the Department of Labor's position is. And they were very much in favor of the case being heard and that PBMs should be considered fiduciaries in that case. I know that the administrations have changed, but the current administration also takes a very firm position that Department of Labor should be more vocal in issuing guidance for employers and really drawing those lines as to who's the fiduciary when those lines are crossed so that employers can operate with some certainty.
The switching that you mentioned in this case reminded me of the GoodRx switching that's going on right now, where a plan will have Caremark as their administrator. And then on the back end, on the pharmacy side, it will adjudicate not as a Caremark claim, but as a GoodRx discount card that's automatically adhered to that, even though our pharmacies do not sign up with GoodRx. Several independent pharmacies don't sign up with them. And so the patient has no idea. They don't give you a GoodRx card. The doctor doesn't send you one. It is completely done at the switch.
Right.
So that, they're saying that they're offering a benefit that the plan is paying for this, but they're not. There's no cost to the plan for doing the GoodRx because the admin fee is coming out of the pharmacy reimbursement. The cost of the drug is usually paid a little bit below if it's GoodRx. So there's a lot of things that are just the smoke and mirrors and cloudy games that PBMs are playing.
Yeah. And Chris, you were mentioning too about the audits. I think that's an area where policymakers might also want to get involved and look, because I too have heard of very aggressive auditing techniques, more or less, twisting of the arm, and whatever the ultimate amount is that's owed back or whatever they hit you with, never makes it back into the self-funded and plan sponsors' pocketbooks. And the same happens on the medical side. I've seen, Blue Cross Blue Shield go and audit, a physician's office, say that they owe, $300,000 and say, but we'll take 100. You just have to sign this non-disclosure form.
Oh, yep.
And, those claims were in large part from self-funded employers, but self-funded employers aren't getting notice of that settlement, and they certainly aren't getting access to those dollars. And it sounds to me that should be, an impermissible gag clause forcing you to sign an NDA. Because as a plan sponsor, I would want to know.
Yeah, I think you're entitled to know. You should be anyway if you're a fiduciary.
Right. Back to the fiduciary concept. Using plan assets for plan and plan participants. Well, if you're taking my money and sweetening the pot on a CEO's executive comp, that's not using my plan money appropriately.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Or raising your premiums to make sure that bonus or compensation package continues to be, market adequate for those individuals. So I completely agree. I know that we have also kind of talked about the other cases and things like that. Is there any other cases that you see, Chris, on the horizon that our listeners should be aware of? Or is there any trends that you're seeing that you get questions about on LinkedIn or in your consulting business that you think would be pertinent for us to know about?
Yeah, I think that definitely keep an eye on the federal side for legislation, that will be very similar to the Braun-Sanders bill that was up last fall. There should be a bill dropping very soon that will require much more transparency on the PBM side and the medical side. As far as lawsuits, I guess, we're just continuing to watch the challenges, like to the Arkansas bill. I know that I believe it was CVS and ESI filed for an injunction stopping the law or claiming that it was unconstitutional and monopolistic. And so I would, definitely just pay attention to, it's an existential threat that these PBMs are under, and they make a tremendous amount of their revenue, obviously. And it's because of the vertical integration. I do think that this is an existential threat to them. So that they will go to the mats on it. Mm-hmm. So definitely those pieces of legislation. As far as what I would, put out there for your members generally, is that employers are eager to hear from you and hear about innovative ideas that you could work with your, either a local pharmacy or your organization with a state purchasing group. I think that there are a lot of opportunities there to take out the middleman. I mean, just think about how much extra juice you'd have if some of that was removed, and it would be enough to share in the savings with the employer and make sure that you're being fairly compensated. I don't think there's any doubt that employers see the benefit in having independent pharmacies. I don't think that that's up for debate. I don't think that there is a pathway right now for them to support that. And so I think we need to explore that more.
We are doing that at PUTT right now. The ball is rolling. That is a huge opportunity, I think, in the market.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
And there are a few PUTT members who have found success going to local county governments, because that's, a smaller entity. It's still a great employer, but they have a vested interest in keeping a local business, alive, usually as well.
And at the end of the day, while the big reforms are necessary and nice, they do take time. They take enforcement. They take an incredible amount of political will. So I think what we're saying as small wins, that's a huge win for a county, right? It's a huge win for the pharmacy involved and for the county if they're able to strike that deal. So we're going to have sort of that groundswell in addition to the policy side, because we can't wait on Washington, and we can't wait on state legislators to solve this for us. We want them to, but it's gonna have to happen on both sides.
Completely agree. Last question. It involves putting on your assistant, AG hat there, but I know that there's been several positive steps with attorneys general across the country and in the pharmacy realm and in enforcement and things like that. Is there any advice that you can give owners who are talking with an AG's office about, they don't really get as many constituents that might call the AG's office as a legislator. So unless it's something very serious that's happening. So is there any advice that you can give to our listeners about how to best communicate with that branch or agency of a state government?
I do think that if we were having this conversation 5 or 6 years ago, it would be a very different story in terms of the receptivity from the AG's office. I guarantee you there's not an AG's office in the country that doesn't know the acronym PBM, which I don't think would be true 6 years ago. Anytime you're dealing with those types of bureaucracies, nobody wants to be the first to the line, but everybody wants to be the fast follower in terms of going after PBMs and signing on to these. So I think that there's a level of familiarity and sophistication in AG's office around this issue. So I would absolutely encourage, if your members have issues or concerns that they want to discuss, or if, they can always offer to be, helpful and educate. Having served in the governor's office and taken those meetings, you often have, and even in AG's office, you often have staffers and young attorneys who this is their first job and they don't know anything because they're probably still on their parents' insurance. And they're getting their education from the PCMA or the pharmaceutical industry or, AHIP, because that's who gets access to the governor's office. And that's who comes in and talks to them. And that's who, comes in, and they're only getting one side of the story. So we have to meet that demand, because there is a demand for information and education, but if it's only ever getting met by one side, we're losing out. So I think it's really important that folks continue to do that work, both with AGs and with legislators.
Chris, you have given us so much hope in this conversation that there are people on the state agency level that are listening, that want to help find solutions, that want us to be resources as independent pharmacists. So that's very, very encouraging from that aspect of it. But thank you so much for spending your time with us today. Yes. Why don't you let our listeners know your social media handles and way they can follow you on LinkedIn, and just making sure that they connect with you, because you have some great insight into what we need to be following. So we appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to talk to this group. Again, knowing my support and passion for this particular issue. Follow me on LinkedIn, my website, versantconsulting.com. And just a little plug, I do have a book coming out this summer. So I will put information about the book on my LinkedIn when it's time for pre-order. So, I always have people saying, what can we do to help? And so go buy the book and buy a couple for your loved ones. You're going to educate your families about the true dysfunction in the U.S. healthcare system. So.
That's wonderful. Well, we can't wait to read it. We can't wait to share it. So again, thank you so much for your time. And Chris Hobart, thank you so much for being my wonderful co-host and helping navigate the yellow brick road of ERISA and lawsuits and all of that fun. And, fiduciary, our second favorite F word when it comes to talking about PBMs, right?
Right.
We love that. Well, again, thank you so much for all of your help today. And you've been listening to this episode of the PUTTcast, brought to you by Pharmacists United for Truth and Transparency. We will see you soon. Check out any of our resources at truthrx.org or follow us on any of our social media spaces. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the PUTTcast. If you don't know us, we are from Pharmacists United for Truth and Transparency, or PUTT, and you can join us at truthrx.org, and you can get a multitude of different resources. You can sign up for our newsletters. You can follow us on social media. You can really get a wealth of information from all of our outlets. You can also donate to our cause at truthrx.org/donate. We appreciate your time today, and hopefully you'll join us for the next episode of the podcast.
PBMs are robbing you day in and day out, making you work for below-cost reimbursements. Billion-dollar corporations hurting hard-working independent pharmacy owners as they line their pockets and put so many of you out of business. And now it's happening with so many pharmacy software vendors that have sold out to billion-dollar hedge funds. Are you truly happy with your pharmacy software vendor? Is support what it used to be, or you find yourself waiting on hold? Are your issues resolved in a timely fashion? When is the last time you took a look at the bill from your pharmacy software vendor? Perhaps it's time for a change. Visit our website at www.datascanpharmacy.com and give us a call at 1-877-222-7979.